What do we mean when we say that the true essence of religion is hidden within its esoteric core? The difference between esoteric and exoteric is crucial to understand the way perennialists are going to argue that one religious truth unites all traditions. Let's start with exotericism. Exotericism accounts for all the diversity we see across traditions, or for some thinkers on the surface level of the same tradition that they form a part of. Esoteric, on the other hand, is what one finds when one dives deeper into the tradition. If you remember from our episode on Aldous Huxley, the British author argues that this one true reality cannot directly be apprehended. In other words, this reality is esoteric to the religious traditions. Let's give two examples as to how this can operate. In his Jewish mysticism in the Middle Ages, scholar Gershom Scholem argues that whereas mysticism on the one hand cannot be communicated due to its very nature, the esoteric can and might be at times communicated, but this communication is forbidden in some way. However, this view is challenged by Glenn Alexander Magee in his introduction to this very useful compendium by arguing that what has been deemed esoteric throughout history has not always been secret, forbidden, or even elitist. Magee gives the example of spiritualism, which was a very populist movement and about which you can read N. Broyd's book, Radical Spirits, or even New Age spiritual practices, which you can refer to this compendium, New Age Spiritualities. The second example I want to give is the fact that most mystical or esoteric aspects of a faith tradition were often developed by persons who were very conservative about their beliefs and tradition. My favorite example of this is the 14th century Dominican priest Meister Eckhart. If you open any book on Christian mysticism, or any book on mysticism in general, you will find quotes or references to Meister Eckhart as this mystic par excellence, due to his concept of God being the ground of all being. I mean, Eckhart did say stuff like, if the soul knows, is aware, or has God, then the soul is far away from God. Or that the greatest honor the soul can bestow upon God is to let God to himself and be free of him. Now, anyone with any interest whatsoever in Eastern religions is going to immediately find a similarity to that famous Zen koan, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. As soon as perennialism and Christianity get divorced, stuff like this is going to be very fertile ground for this perennialist project. However, when Eckhart is used by perennialists to push for this one universal truth behind all religious traditions, what is very often ignored is the fact that Eckhart depends on the concept of the Trinity to have his theology work. Eckhart developed a very meticulous philosophical view of how the concept of the Trinity works in a kind of boiling over of God into the world of nature through Christ. It's very complicated stuff that attests to Eckhart's very philosophical background, and when perennialists ignore this aspect of him, they're ignoring a very crucial aspect. You might want to refer to Meister Eckhart by Kurt Flush, who actually argues that Meister Eckhart should be considered as a philosopher before being considered as a mystic, if at all. Now, it is true that the work of Meister Eckhart was considered heretical by the church. However, this leaves us with a very tricky dilemma. On the one hand, the religious tradition that Meister Eckhart lived and depended upon to develop his philosophy and his mystical works is going to view him with suspicion. On the other hand, at least more modern perennialists are going to use Meister Eckhart to show that perennialism does not need Christian exclusivity. In other words, Meister Eckhart is not being allowed to speak for himself. This is going to be the critique that we're going to be leveling against perennialism in the next episode. Again, this is not an attack on perennialism as such. I'm just bringing to light the critiques of perennialism because it has to contend with them very seriously if it needs to stand up to philosophical scrutiny. But that's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed another episode of TeaSoteric.